Derek stood in our bedroom doorway, arms crossed, watching me struggle to sit up against the pillows. I still had the surgical brace strapped around my lower back. I still had the faint bruise from the IV line on my hand, and he said it like he was reading me a weather report. This Saturday, my whole family is staying with us for 2 weeks, 12 people. Have everything ready. I actually laughed, thinking it was a joke. Then I looked at his face. He wasn't joking. That was the moment I understood something had shifted in our marriage, and nobody had told me. I'm Renee, 47 years old, and this happened 5 days after spinal surgery. 5 days since my surgeon closed the incision along my back and told me, in that flat clinical voice doctors use when they want you to actually listen, that I needed a minimum of 4 weeks without lifting, without standing more than 15 minutes at a stretch, without climbing stairs more than once or twice a day. He'd handed me a printed sheet with the restrictions in bold. It was still folded in my nightstand drawer, next to the pain medication I was trying not to need. "Derek," I said, keeping my voice even, "I just had surgery. Can we postpone it even by a few days?" He didn't look up from his phone. "No one is waiting. Just do as I say." That sentence landed somewhere I didn't expect, not in my chest, but lower in my stomach, in the place where something curdles. 22 years of marriage, and he'd never spoken to me quite like that. Not with that particular coldness, like I was an employee who'd asked for a day off during a busy season, and he was simply informing me the request was denied. I didn't argue. I've never argued well in the moment. I need time to turn things over before I know what I actually think. So I nodded, and he left the room satisfied, already texting his mother the arrival details, I assumed. That night, I lay awake long after Derek's breathing evened out beside me. My back ached in that deep, structural way that reminded me a surgeon had cut through muscle to reach bone. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I actually let myself think about the last 2 decades instead of just living through them. Every summer without fail, Derek's family descended on our house like a small, cheerful army. His parents, Walter and Carol, married 50 years, with opinions about everything from how I loaded the dishwasher to how I seasoned a roast. His brother Trevor, who liked to say, usually after his third beer, that this house had always felt like the family house, as if that were a compliment and not a small act of erasure. Trevor's wife and their 2 teenagers. Derek's younger sister, her husband, and their toddler, who was adorable, but who also meant 2 weeks of cutting grapes into quarters and wiping down high chairs. 12 people, 2 weeks, every summer since we got married. I'd done the math once, years ago, out of curiosity, and stopped when the number of hours started to feel like an accusation. I bought groceries off a specific list because Carol didn't eat gluten and Walter didn't eat anything spicy. I made up the guest room, blew up the air mattresses. I did mountains of laundry that smelled like other people's homes. I drove to the airport. I planned every meal. I smiled in photographs where I was always standing slightly outside the frame, the one who'd just run back into the kitchen to check on something. Not once in 22 years had anyone asked if I was tired. I thought about our daughter Hannah, away at college, asleep in some dorm room 3 states over, unaware her mother was lying in the dark doing arithmetic on her own exhaustion. I thought about the promise I'd made myself in the hospital recovery room, that this surgery was going to be the thing that finally slowed me down. That finally made me protect myself the way I'd spent 2 decades protecting everyone else. I reached for my laptop instead of the pill bottle. I wanted my head clear, and for the first time in my marriage, I opened the folder containing the deed to our house. My parents bought that house in 1994. I grew up in it, in the room that later became my daughter's nursery, then Carol's guest room every summer, without her ever once thanking me for the fresh sheets. When my father passed 8 years ago and my mother 2 years after him, the house came to me. Not to me and Derek, to me. I remembered signing papers, Derek beside me checking his phone, saying, "That's great, honey," without looking up. He'd never asked to see the deed. He'd never needed to. In his mind, from the day we moved our furniture in, it simply became our house. Somewhere in that quiet grammatical shift, my ownership dissolved into something communal, something he felt entitled to open up to 12 relatives without asking me first. I read every page twice. Sole owner. My name and only my name beneath my father's signature and the notary's seal. I sat there at 1 in the morning and felt something in me settle. Not anger exactly. Something steadier. Clarity. The next morning after Derek left for work, I called Patricia Hensley, the attorney who'd handled my parents' estate. I told her everything, the surgery, the 12 relatives, Derek's flat refusal to even consider postponing. She listened without interrupting. "Renee," she said finally, "whose name is on the deed? Mine, just mine. Then legally, you have full authority over who occupies that property and under what conditions. Your husband doesn't need to co-sign a decision about your own home. You're not asking permission, you're informing him." She paused. "You had major surgery 5 days ago. You are not obligated to host anyone while you're recovering. Setting boundaries isn't cruelty, Renee. It's the bare minimum of taking care of yourself." I wrote that down on a sticky note and pressed it to my laptop. We spent another 20 minutes on logistics, what I could legally do, how to keep everything documented and defensible. "Paper trail," she kept saying. "Everything in writing." I want to be honest, I wasn't plotting revenge. I was tired and scared of my own body's limits for maybe the first time in my adult life. And I was starting, slowly, to understand that the house my father left me didn't have to be a place where I disappeared into service every summer. I opened a fresh document and began making a list. Not a grocery list, a plan. By Thursday, I had 3 calls scheduled, made from my car in a pharmacy parking lot, 2 miles from the house, seat reclined to keep pressure off my back. I didn't want Derek walking past and overhearing. Not because anything I was doing was illegal, but because I needed to finish before he talked me out of it, the way he always managed to. The first call went to Maple Grove Restoration, an interior renovation company. I told the woman on the phone, Angela, that I needed a full assessment: flooring, paint, drywall work upstairs where an old water stain had never been fixed. All true, incidentally. I'd been meaning to fix that stain for 2 years. Angela said she could send a 3-person crew Saturday morning and the work would take about 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Something in my chest unclenched at the words. The second call went to a heating and cooling company for an emergency inspection of the central air, which actually had been rattling for a month. The third call went to a painting company Patricia recommended, one reliable about honoring its contract terms, including the standard clause about occupancy during active work. No residents on the premises during interior painting and floor refinishing, for safety and liability reasons. That clause was the whole point. I had it read back to me twice. By Saturday morning, all 3 crews were scheduled between 8 and 9. My insurance confirmed I qualified for short-term recovery housing at a rehabilitation apartment complex 15 minutes away. Grab bars, single-level layout. A nurse doing wellness checks twice a week. I hadn't mentioned this to Derek because he hadn't asked. Not once in 5 days had he asked where I actually planned to recover while hosting 12 people. I packed Friday night while Derek was at his brother's, finalizing arrival logistics. I left a note on the counter, not dramatic, just factual. Gone to recovery housing per doctor's orders. House is closed for scheduled renovation beginning Saturday. Contractors have keys. Please don't interfere with their schedule. It's a liability issue with the insurance. I drove myself to the rehab apartment, wincing at every pothole, and slept better than I had in 5 days. But what happened the next morning completely changed everything. I wasn't there to see it, but Derek told me later in pieces, and I stitched the rest together from what he and eventually Carol admitted. 3 SUVs pulled into the driveway around 10, packed with suitcases, coolers, folding chairs. 12 people spilled onto the lawn, already arguing about who'd sleep where. And taped to the front door, laminated so they wouldn't curl in the humidity, were 2 signs: home closed for renovation, no occupancy until further notice, per contractor and insurance requirements. Through the front windows they could see the crew already inside, a man sanding the hallway floor, plastic sheeting over the furniture, the chemical smell of primer drifting through the screen door. Carol said Derek stood on the porch for what felt like a very long time, just staring at the sign. The foreman came out, polite but firm, and explained the property was under an active service contract prohibiting occupancy during the work. Nothing personal, sir. Just company policy. Derek called me 4 times before I even turned my phone back on. When I finally did, sitting on the edge of my narrow bed, I watched the missed calls stack up like something building toward a wave. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a strange, unfamiliar calm, the quiet of a woman who has, for the first time in 2 decades, made a decision entirely for herself. I let the 4th call go to voicemail and picked up on the 5th. "What did you do?" No greeting. Just that, dropped on the table between us like an accusation. I kept my voice level. "Exactly what my surgeon asked me to do. I'm recovering from major surgery. I told you 5 days ago I needed you to postpone this trip, and you told me no one was waiting." Silence, longer than it probably was. Then he hung up. Carol called next, tight with the fury of a woman used to getting her way through sheer persistence. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? We drove 6 hours. This is completely selfish of you, Renee. Completely." She caught herself before finishing the word, but I heard the shape of it anyway. I didn't argue. I texted her a photo of my discharge paperwork instead, the restrictions printed in bold. No lifting over 10 pounds. No standing longer than 15 minutes. Minimum 4 weeks recovery. Then, "This is why. I hope you all find comfortable arrangements." I turned my phone face down and didn't look at it again that day. Walter's voicemail came that evening, booming even through the tinny speaker, something about how I'd made the family look foolish. I listened once, deleted it, and found my hands weren't even shaking. I'd expected to feel shaken. Instead, I felt like someone who'd finally set down a piece of furniture she'd carried so long, she'd forgotten her arms could ache from anything else. Meanwhile, Derek was navigating a crisis I'd spent 22 summers quietly managing without him ever noticing the machinery behind it. Every hotel nearby was booked for a wedding, so he ended up paying nearly $4,000 for 2 weeks at a hotel by the interstate. He was the one figuring out at 9 at night what a family of 12 wanted for dinner, only to learn Walter didn't like the Italian place and Carol's stomach couldn't handle the Mexican compromise. He was the one driving his parents to the pharmacy, driving the teenagers to the outlet mall, fielding a dozen small requests that used to simply resolve themselves before he even noticed them, because I had always resolved them first. I wasn't there to see any of it, but I could picture it with unsettling clarity, because I'd lived it myself for 22 summers, invisible and unthanked. I spent my days at the rehab apartment doing my physical therapy exercises, icing my back, reading a novel I'd started 8 months ago and never finished because there was never quiet enough in my own house to hold a thought for more than 10 minutes. On the 3rd night, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, I let myself feel, without guilt trailing behind it, something close to peace. By the 5th day, Derek's texts started to shift. The first 2 days had been all capital letters and barely restrained fury. By Wednesday, long day, no punctuation, just two flat words at 11 at night. Thursday, Mom wants steak. Dad says no red meat since his cholesterol appointment. Can't win. I didn't respond to either. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I just didn't have an answer yet, and I'd stopped believing it was my job to always have one. That week I heard from Hannah, who'd gotten an earful from her grandmother and called sounding more amused than alarmed. Mom, Grandma Carol called asking if I could talk some sense into you. I told her you just had spine surgery and she should talk some sense into herself. I laughed for the first time in nearly a week. Something loosening in my chest at the sound of my daughter, defending me without my even asking. Derek called on the 6th day, his voice worn down at the edges. The kids are cranky. Mom says the hotel pillows are too firm. Dad wants to know why we can't just stay at Trevor's, which, Renee, his house isn't big enough for 4 people, let alone 12, but somehow ours always was. He stopped. Like he'd surprised himself. I've been doing the grocery runs every morning. Mom has an opinion about every item. I didn't realize how much. He didn't finish the sentence. I didn't finish it for him. That was the moment I opened the spreadsheet I'd kept for 15 years. I want to explain what that spreadsheet was because it wasn't born from bitterness, not originally. I'd started it back when Hannah was in elementary school, mostly to track our household budget. But somewhere along the way, I'd started logging the summer visits too, out of the same instinct that made me keep receipts for everything else. Groceries during the 2-week visits, always noticeably higher than normal. The spike in water and electric bills every July. 2 replacement air mattresses the teenagers had punctured. A new guest room mattress after Walter's back trouble required something firmer. A rental car the year Trevor's transmission gave out mid-visit. 3 separate years of airfare for Carol and Walter when their retirement account, as Walter put it, was a little tight. I sat at the small kitchen table and added it all up slowly, carefully. The way you count something you've been avoiding counting. The number at the bottom of the column made me sit back in my chair. $179,340. Over 22 years. I didn't cry, though I thought I might. Instead, I felt something colder and clearer settle over me. The same precise, unemotional clarity I imagine a surgeon feels studying an X-ray before an operation. I thought about Derek's voice on the phone, worn thin after less than a week of doing what I'd done for 2 decades without complaint. I thought about how quickly the family story about me, selfish, ungrateful, difficult, had assembled itself the moment I stopped absorbing the cost of their comfort. Nobody had ever asked what it cost me. I spent the final days of my 2 weeks preparing something I'd never made before, a presentation about my own marriage. I titled the cover page simply, *22 years of hospitality. Underneath, the total. Then page by page, the breakdown. Groceries itemized against our normal monthly averages. The July utility spikes circled in red. The air mattresses, the guest bed, the rental car, the airfare. I included photographs too, Carol in the kitchen I'd stocked, Walter asleep in the recliner I'd bought specifically for his back. Receipts, scanned and dated. Undeniable. I called Derek and asked him to gather everyone at the house that evening. The renovation crew had finished 2 days early, floors gleaming, the water stain gone, the air conditioning finally running quiet and even. I arrived still moving carefully, brace loosened now, 6 days further into recovery, and found all 12 of them in the living room, on furniture that still smelled faintly of fresh paint. I could see it on their faces, the assumption that I'd come to apologize, to cry a little, to let them comfort me back into my old role. Carol even stood, arms half raised for the kind of embrace that precedes forgiveness. I didn't sit down. I handed out folders, one to each person, and said nothing until everyone had one in their lap. Then I stood by the fireplace, the same spot I'd stood in 100 Christmas photos, always slightly out of frame, and let them read the cover page in silence. Carol's face changed first, then Walter's. Trevor flipped through faster than the others, jaw tightening as he landed on the rental car receipt from the year his transmission failed. "Can anyone name one vacation?" I said, my voice steady, quieter than I expected, "where I was treated like a guest instead of the maid?" Nobody answered. The room had gone completely still. "Can anyone remember asking whether I was healthy enough, or rested enough, or simply willing, before inviting yourselves into my home for 2 weeks, every summer?" For 22 years, still nothing. Derek sat on the arm of the sofa, staring down at his folder, and I watched something happen in his face I hadn't seen in a long time. Not defensiveness, something closer to recognition. "I'm not asking for the money back," I said, and I meant it. I kept this because somewhere along the way I stopped trusting my own sense of what was fair. I needed to see it written down to believe it myself. I looked at Carol. I have loved having this family in my life. I have never once loved being invisible in my own house. Walter cleared his throat but said nothing. Trevor closed his folder, ears red. Carol sat back down slowly, the folder still open to the photograph of herself in my kitchen. Looking less like a woman preparing an argument, and more like one confronting an accounting she hadn't expected to face. I didn't wait for an apology that night. I knew it wasn't coming yet, and I'd stopped needing it on any particular schedule. I gathered my things, told Derek I'd see him at home once the paint smell cleared, and drove back to the rehab apartment for one more night, the record of my own labor finally sitting in someone else's hands instead of mine. I moved back home 11 days after I'd left, walking through rooms that smelled of fresh paint instead of the usual chaos of a family visit winding down. It felt like moving into a version of my own home that had been waiting for me all along, underneath the version I'd been living in for 22 years. Derek and I didn't have one big dramatic conversation. Real repair doesn't work that way. It happens in 100 small adjustments over time. A few days later, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of cold coffee, he turned his mug slowly in his hands. I didn't know it added up to that much. Not just the money, all of it. I never had to know, you always just handled it. "I know," I said, not trying to make him feel worse, just telling the truth. "I'm not going to pretend those 2 weeks weren't awful," he admitted, a tired laugh escaping him. "Mom complained about hotel pillows for 4 straight days. I don't think I slept more than 5 hours a night." He looked up, something more honest in his face than I'd seen in years. "But I understand now. I actually understand. We agreed on something we should have agreed on years earlier. No more open-door policy. Any future visit from his family or mine would require both of our agreement in advance, with clear expectations. Guests would help with groceries, clean up after themselves, and stop treating me as staff simply because I knew where everything was kept." The real test came 6 weeks later, at a smaller dinner, just Derek's parents, invited properly with 2 weeks' notice. Walter arrived stiff and formal, complimenting the renovated hallway in a tone that suggested he was trying hard to find something safe to say. Carol brought a casserole dish, something she'd never once done in 22 years, and set it on the counter carefully, almost like an offering. Partway through dinner, Trevor called Derek's phone. He hadn't been invited this time, something we'd agreed on together, and I heard Derek's voice shift into something firmer than I was used to hearing him use with his brother. "No, Trevor, not this time. We're keeping it small. You're welcome to visit, but you'll need to plan it with us in advance, same as anyone else." I looked up from the stove, surprised, and found Derek watching me, checking, I think, whether he'd said the right thing. I nodded and he nodded back. Later, as his parents left, Walter paused at the door and said gruffly, not quite looking at me, "House looks good. The floor." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close to one. But it was Walter acknowledging something out loud he'd once have considered beneath him to notice, and I let that be enough for now. It was Derek, though, who surprised me most. A few nights later, I overheard him on the phone with his father, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "Dad, I need you to understand something. This is Renee's home, too, if we're being precise about it. It was her home before it was ever mine. I should have remembered that years ago, and I didn't, and that's on me, not her." A pause, Walter's voice rumbling on the other end. Then Derek said simply, "I'm not arguing about it anymore. That's just how it's going to be." I stood in the doorway with a dish towel in my hands, listening to my husband defend me to his father for what might have been the first time in our entire marriage. And something settled in my chest that had been unsettled for far longer than I'd realized. If I had known, going into that surgery, that it would take losing my patience completely to finally be seen in my own home, I might have done this years sooner. Months passed. Autumn came, the leaves turning, my back finally healed, the brace long packed away. Then one Tuesday evening in October, my phone rang. It was Carol. I almost didn't answer, out of old habit more than anything. But I did, and her voice was different than I expected, smaller, almost tentative, nothing like the commanding tone I'd known for 2 decades. "Renee," she said, "I was wondering, would next Saturday be a good time to visit, just for the afternoon? I'd call ahead, of course, and bring something for lunch if that's all right with you." I smiled, standing alone in my kitchen, the late afternoon light coming gold through the window over the sink. It wasn't an apology. Carol, I suspected, would never quite manage those exact words. But it was something I'd waited 22 years to hear. A woman who had once treated my home as a birthright now asking gently, humbly, if she might be allowed to knock. "Saturday would be lovely, Carol," I said. "I'll see you then. If you've ever felt invisible in your own home, if you've ever given so much of yourself that people forgot to ask whether you had anything left to give, I hope this story reminded you that it's never too late to be seen." I'd love to know what you would have done in my situation. And where are you watching from tonight? Drop a comment below. I read every one. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. We've got new stories like this waiting for you every day.